Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at some short field takeoff and landing tips. So the goal of this video is, not to be like crazy instructional as far as give you like every little method, but it's just to show you some kind of slick little methods that you can use in order to decrease or increase or reduce the length of takeoff and landings, especially in nasty strips like this little one we're on today. So let's go ahead and jump in. So first things first, when you're taking an aircraft off from a relatively short runway, and again, if you look at this runway, you're like, hey, this thing's pretty big, but it's going to work pretty well for our demonstration today. We need to consider the balance between using the flaps and not using the flaps. If we just sit there and rip down the runway with our flaps down, remember those flaps will shorten our takeoff run a little bit. But keep in mind, they also are going to go ahead and add a teeny bit of drag, which is actually going to, in some cases, make things worse. Now, what people will do to try to get around this is they'll do something silly like dropping the flaps down significantly. You can do a takeoff with this aircraft with this level of flaps, but if you were to do something like that, of course, all that extra drag those flaps are going to give you is going to cancel out that extra lift benefit. The other problem, of course, is if you have an underpowered plane like this little one right here, you're really going to struggle to get any altitude after you get airborne. There's also a tendency, of course, to go ahead and slap the flap lever up after takeoff. Now, the trick we can do to actually get around that, and one of the things I kind of like about this aircraft, is you can actually manually set the flap switch. So one of the tricks I always tell people is I always say, take a look at your aileron position and compare them to your flap position. If your ailerons and your flaps are at the same altitude or angle, I should be more specific here, that would indicate that that would be your maximum amount of lift for that particular thing. So this particular aircraft, I can actually set myself, it's almost like flaps 10 almost, and you can see that they're pretty well lined up. This would be the absolute maximum flap setting I'd ever want to use during a regular takeoff. So I'm going to go ahead and do a regular takeoff. Of course, if you're on grass, you'd never sit here and rev up the engine as much as you can, but this would be your general technique. You go ahead and hold the brakes all the way down, you rev up, make sure your air-fuel mixture is set correctly, and you go ahead and let go of the controls. Off we go. Now, as soon as you're in the green arc, you want to lift up the front wheel. The trick here is you want to pop a wheelie with the plane. You don't want to just rip the thing as high as you can. So just lift the nose about at 6 inches off the ground. And when the aircraft is ready to take off on its own, because you set the flaps correctly, it'll actually take off on its own quite easily. Now, this aircraft, we can climb it up to 50 knots, which is literally right on the edge of a death stall. So kind of keep that in mind. Now, don't put up that notch of flaps until you've gotten some altitude underneath you. Failure to do so will result in destruction of the aircraft. Don't be that guy. All right, I'm going to clap the flaps back up, and we are back on our way. So that is a basic technique to go ahead and optimize, no matter what airplane you're flying, any sort of landing distances. Again, if you use that technique, you're always going to be able to take off basically with the minimum amount of distance behind you. Now, sometimes you're sitting there going, is there a way that we can reduce that distance even more? You can reduce that distance even more. And that's something I like to call hop takeoff, which is somebody who used to fly bush. I had a really long discussion about how incredibly dangerous that particular technique is. But, try explaining that to some of those folks. They're not going to be, they're not always agreeable about some of those things, to say the least. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and align myself back up for another runway, and we'll go ahead and get ready for a landing. All right, we are all set and ready for our landing now. So in a normal landing approach, you want to go ahead and make sure your flaps are as far down as you can get them. And basically what that's going to do is create a tremendous amount of drag that's going to make it a little bit easier to slow the plane down. Now, one of the problems with flaps, and anybody will tell you this who has any experience with them, is the fact they'll tell you they make your brakes less effective. You're sitting there going, wait, what? Well, think about it for a second. If your flaps create extra lift and we're trying to put pressure on the tires so that we can engage the brakes at full power, we definitely want to go ahead and make sure that we have our flaps in a position where they can help you brake. The problem is, that's going to go directly against needing to slow the airplane, or I should say, providing with that lift to safely land the plane. So the next trick I'm going to show you is how to make a very short landing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach the runway basically 5 knots above minimum speed here. Again, minimum speed for us is about 38 knots. So we're doing about 40 right now. My flaps are all the way down. I'm actually going to land around that tree right there that I'm seeing. Now the danger here is if I pull these controls back by as much as an inch, it will cause the aircraft to instantaneously stall. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to get the aircraft as close to the ground at this low speed. Again, you want about 5 knots over stall, which is tremendously dangerous. I reduce it because my angle's starting to come up. And now what I'm going to do is right when I get to the ground, I've gone ahead and killed my throttle here, lift the nose up, and I'm going to go ahead and bring my flaps up before the plane is actually landed. As the plane slows down, just hold the nose up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull all the way back on my controls and hold the brakes back as hard as I can. Because my flaps are up now, they're not going to be giving me that resistance. And since I'm pulling back on my controls, I'm putting pressure, just like a spoiler on a car, on the back tires, which is decreasing my landing roll. So you can see in this particular case, I was able to come down and land in a very, very, very short distance. In the real world, by the way, you can't really get away with this easily on account of the fact that grass tends to cause you to skid if you jam on the brakes. So that's something that we don't have to deal with in the flight simulator. In the real world, you'd have to be a little more ginger on those brakes. But again, killing those flaps like that got me down a lot faster. Of course, it's a tremendously dangerous maneuver, and it's something you want to practice quite a bit. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us set up one more time, and we'll go ahead and show you a hop takeoff. Okay, so this is going to be the absolute, I've got to get this plane in the air as aggressively and quickly as I possibly can. What am I going to do? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave my flaps in the up position so they provide me with no drag whatsoever. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to accelerate up to my flaps down liftoff speed. The moment I get to it, I'm going to jam my flaps to the down position. What I'm basically going to achieve here is I'm going to create a sudden burst of lift without creating all that extra drag. Now, an aircraft like the Cessna here, unfortunately, they're motorized flaps. So when I go click, 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 you can see, and they take a long time to get to the down position, which is lame. If I were flying a plane which had the old school flaps where you had basically a little handbrake, you could just lift up to go ahead and get airborne, that would be a wonderful, wonderful way to get us going even quicker and more efficiently. So for this aircraft, we have to basically count to 10 after we let go of the brakes and then start putting our flaps back down because it's the only way you're going to get them down in time. All right, let's do it. So I'm going to go ahead and stand on the brakes just like I did before. I'm going to push the throttle all the way forward, pull back just a teeny tiny bit because I'm on a soft field. Wait until my engine is maximum power. It's going to give you a nice little shake. We'll release the brakes. Here we go. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 9, 10. 2 notches of flaps. And we should hit it just when we get to the minimum speed, and we pop the nose up just like that, right as the flaps go down to that position that we're going to need them to. Now, when you do this, you have to be so ginger on the controls because we are literally flying this aircraft at a minimum speed. So you have to be gentle. Don't bring the flaps up early. Okay, gently bring the flaps up. So 1 notch, wait until the aircraft picks up a little bit of speed, bring that nose down to a safer speed. Again, make sure you're clear of obstacles, bring up that next notch of flaps. Here comes the drop, and we are now safe. That is how you're going to get this airplane in the air as fast as possible. So hopefully this video was helpful. Again, I showed you a couple different techniques here. It's basically about manipulating the flaps in order to get yourself an even more, I should say even less landing distance as well as takeoff distance. Again, consider obstacles. You know, if there's a big mountain in the way, there's no amount of tricks that you can use that is going to possibly get you over that mountain before you go smacking into it. Another technique that I've seen people use, which I find extremely dangerous, is basically to pick up as much speed on the ground as possible and fly the aircraft in ground effect and basically pull up and turn at the last possible second. I've seen that technique used before to basically dodge really nasty obstacles at the end of runways, but I don't necessarily recommend that because it can end badly very quickly. As usual, hopefully this video has been helpful as far as giving you some kind of quick tips. You can do these things in airliners, but again, the FAA does not recommend doing any of these. You're supposed to be using full flaps for landing unless it's a heavy wind. You're supposed to be using the standard amount of flaps for takeoff, again, unless you have a long runway. So kind of keep those things in mind and kind of temper your expectations. But it is a pretty fun trick, and it's, again, one of those little tiny bush things that I've learned from talking to way too many people over the years. Enjoy.